Samsung's S24 lineup is here. The much anticipated February software update arrived to fix a lot of the early issues, and we covered this in detail in the last video. That one focused on the S24 Ultra, a phone that I described as a near-perfect phone. But you know what's better than a near-perfect phone? A cheaper near-perfect phone. Of course, I'm talking about the S24 and the S24 Plus, and this is how I initially thought I'd be setting up this review. How they both offer far better value for money than the Ultra, and that they're the ones most people should buy. But having tested the phones thoroughly, it's not that simple this year, and Samsung's decision to switch back to Exynos processors for the international markets has caused some problems. Current owners of an S23 or those thinking about getting an S24, you're gonna want to watch this, because we'll be discussing not just how they compare with the new Ultra, but if they're actually an upgrade from last year's phones at all. If you're looking for unboxings, you can find those videos linked in the video description. Design-wise, this is even more of a subtle refinement from last year's models than the Ultra is. From the back it seems unchanged, the overall shape and size is almost identical. The S24s are a fraction taller but narrower, and the LED position is just slightly lower. The button layout is also the same, but the sides are now flat and have a matte finish, which should help reduce fingerprints. The bigger change is at the front, with thinner bezels, and the hole punch is a hair smaller too, but as you can see, it's a very minor visual upgrade. In fact, you could argue the biggest change is the new colours. I really like this marble grey S24, whose closest companion would be last year's cream S23. And for the Plus models I went for black, and as you can see, this year's finish is much lighter. Somebody commented on my unboxing that they hate how iPhone-like the Galaxies are now, but I personally see this as a good thing. The visual appeal of the 15 Pro, but that runs Android 14? Yes please. I expected the flat sides to be more uncomfortable in the hand, but was surprised to find that they actually feel very similar because the edges are essentially just as sharp on last year's models. Even though the sides were rounded last year, and with no obvious size difference, they're actually equally as comfortable to use. It's interesting with the new Ultra because those rounded sides feel great. They're smoother and more comfortable than the flat S24 sides, but the squared off corners dig into your hands a lot more, so there are trade-offs either way. The key difference is in the size of the model you choose. The smaller S24 has always had an ergonomic advantage over the Plus and Ultra in how much lighter it is, fitting inside a pocket, and the ease of use with reaching across the display, one-handed use, and gaming. To a lesser extent, the Plus has these advantages over the Ultra as well, certainly the lighter weight. But the Ultra does now have a matching flat display, that's been a deal breaker for me in the past, and it's exclusively got the S Pen for a completely unique experience with navigation and productivity. The counter-argument for the size is that actually things like gaming can be easier on the bigger screen because you've got more space for your controls. You've got more space to type on the keyboard two-handed as well. And viewing content is more enjoyable on those big 6.7 and 6.8 inch displays of the Plus and Ultra. Those really give you that immersive, cinematic experience at the expense of being heavier, less comfortable devices to manage. You've got the boxier, squared-off shape of the Ultra against the rounded S24s to contend with too, just on an aesthetic level. I've always held the seemingly unpopular opinion that the rounded design looks better, though the Ultra now having symmetrical bezels as well has closed the gap for me. So really consider your priorities here, because the phone's size is perhaps the single most important factor, and people often go quickly chasing a big screen, the battery life or the specs of the Ultra for instance, but then underestimate the weight and comfort of using the phones. It's ultimately why I'll be choosing the regular S24 again this year. A word on durability, that's almost unchanged. The phones have the same IP68 ingress protection and the same Gorilla Glass Victors too, so no new anti-reflective armor glass like with this year's Ultra. They do get a slightly more durable second generation of the armor aluminium frame though, but again the Ultra is still ahead with the new titanium frame instead. Trimming down the bezels has meant a 0.1 of an inch increase in the screen size without making the phones bigger, so we're back to having 6.2 and 6.7 inch displays for the regular S24s. They get the same LTPO tech, so the refresh rate can now go down as low as 1 Hz, and they get the increased peak brightness of 2600 nits. They sadly don't get the anti-reflective glass properties of the new Ultra, but you may be able to see that they're slightly more readable now outdoors in bright sunlight. I especially noticed this when looking at the viewfinder taking photos. The Plus model also gets an increased resolution to match the Ultra's 1440p display. It was a controversial move to knock this down to 1080p in the past, and the regular S24 is sadly still stuck here. But you notice the resolution on the Plus model's bigger screen far more. So it makes sense here, and you won't notice as much on the smaller S24 anyway. Still, this does separate the S24 from the Plus model, and you would be getting a bigger upgrade in choosing the Plus this year. Interestingly, this does now mean that the Ultra no longer has an obvious display advantage, unless of course you really want that boxier look, S Pen compatibility, or the extra 0.1 of an inch in screen size. Any of those could actually be the deal breaker for you, they're just not for me. But you also shouldn't overlook the Ultra's armor glass, because it's not just useful for the anti-reflective properties, there's also a clear difference in the richness and saturation of colours. Blacks in particular are far deeper and bolder, and I believe this is down to the new glass. It almost looks like when phones switched from LCD to OLED. You may have spotted this in the Ultra review as well, and the difference in real life really is as drastic as you see here. If you're torn between a Plus and an Ultra, maybe think about this too. As for the speakers, we have the new cutout design, and I did think the speaker quality was slightly clearer and louder this year. The Plus model is louder still, and surprisingly, slightly more so and even clearer than the new Ultra. Really the big new thing is Galaxy AI. That's the dominating upgrade Samsung wants to highlight this year. But they've confirmed that most, if not all of those features are coming to the S23 series now anyway as part of One UI 6.1, possibly as early as this month too. Galaxy AI may run a bit faster on the latest models, but it's not really a reason to choose an S24 over an S23. Still, if you want to see a breakdown of all the key new AI features, then do check out the Ultra review where I covered those in detail. Also remember that Samsung has promised an increased 7 years of software and security updates for the new S24 series. So even though the S23s are cheaper now, you may want to consider the long-term investment too. Remember last year when Samsung finally unified their entire lineup and offered the same Snapdragon chips worldwide? There were no arguments about which chip was better, no customers got the worst version of the phone. Yeah, that was great. I mean, go back and watch how I glowingly praised the S23 series in my review. Well, Samsung has gone back on that this year and given us the Exynos 2400 for the international markets. Here in the UK, those are the ones I have. Samsung of course tells us the chipsets will perform the same, but historically that's not been true, and historically it's always the Exynos models that are worse. Confusingly, the Ultra is still Snapdragon worldwide though, and maybe that's telling from Samsung that they've chosen a Snapdragon chipset for their most expensive flagship model. The Plus model gets bumped up to 12GB of RAM to match the Ultra, and it still has double the storage of the baseline S24, whilst the 1TB option is reserved only for the Ultra. Ultra-wideband tech is also still only available on the two bigger models, for whatever reason. But let's start with how the S24s compare to the S23s, and this is how the scores initially stacked up, showing modest gains for the CPU and more substantial ones for the GPU. But then I repeated the test for the latest software in March, and the S23 series actually improved a bit. So I'll show you the results based on the latest software. I didn't feel any substantial difference using the phones day to day, but there's a healthy upgrade for the graphics in particular, which you can feel with high performance gaming. Not just higher frame rates, but more efficient performance too. I didn't really see any thermal improvements in these results, despite the new 1.5 times larger vapor chambers, and the phones feel equally as warm in my hands. I do still have some concerns about the long-term performance. The S24 dominated in the Solar Bay ray tracing stress tests and has shown huge GPU gains, but showed poorer stability for the Wildlife Extreme stress test. In fact, the lower-end score actually dipped below that of the S23. There was no obvious suggestion of overheating causing this, but it does bring into question the longer-term gaming performance and, once again, the age-old debate of Exynos versus Snapdragon. Performance is mostly consistent across the S24 lineup as well. I would suggest you go for one of the bigger models if you're more of a power user, on account of the higher RAM and also the better battery life you'll get. But of course the regular S24 is more powerful than most people will ever need. There are hints that the Exynos and Snapdragon chips are different. It was interesting seeing the Exynos models score higher in the OpenCL Geekbench scores, but otherwise they trailed behind, and were consistently behind in the 3D Mark tests. This culminates in a difference of around 1 frame per second, so it's not something you'll likely notice when actually using these phones. And realistically, you need to compare two like-for-like phones to know for sure. Statistically, the Ultra is slightly more powerful, but there's really not a lot in it separating the S24 series in terms of performance. There is, however, when it comes to battery life. The bigger phones of course have bigger batteries, and actually both the S24 and S24 Plus get slightly larger batteries compared to last year's models. Of course you'd then expect longer battery life, but my experience wasn't as simple as that. If you look closely at the battery lives after identical performance testing, you've got 11% more remaining on the S24 and 6% more for the Plus. When used more heavily, they do seem to perform more efficiently. But I also wanted to get an idea with more typical daily use, and so used the phones identically for various tasks like streaming YouTube and TikTok, scrolling social media, using the camera, just everyday tasks, and then I'd find a much smaller gap, albeit with the S24s still coming out on top. But this was still a test environment, and having used each of the phones as a daily device, I didn't feel like the battery life was better at all. And then I realised why. Here's how the battery lives looked after leaving them for a while in standby. The S23 has not only caught up, but pulled ahead. This happened with the Plus models too. The S24s drain faster when locked in your pocket, and that's typically where they spend most of the time for the average person. So although actually using the phones you should get a slight increase in battery life, particularly heavy users and gamers, in reality I think you should prepare for the same battery life overall, and in some cases for it to be worse. Exynos has traditionally trailed behind Snapdragon for power efficiency, so I can't help but wonder if that's a factor here too. With the Ultra, I do feel like there's a small battery improvement overall, whereas I don't so much with these two. If there are any S24 owners in the comments, particularly if you've upgraded from an S23, let me know how the battery life has been for you. If you wanted an idea of the battery comparisons for each of the new models, here you can see a typical breakdown for the relative performance. The Plus and Ultra stand a fair way in front of the baseline S24. You could stretch the S24 to a day and a half, but more intensive users should go for one of the bigger models. This year I was seeing the Ultra consistently ahead of the Plus model too, and that makes sense given the slightly larger battery. But remember last year I found the Plus model could even outperform the Ultra's battery, and it had an even smaller battery size then. So once again, I'm wondering if the Exynos power efficiency is not as good as the Snapdragon variant. A word on charging, we still have a maximum of 25W fast charging on the base S24, whilst the Plus and Ultra models get 45W charging. The same deal as last year. You don't see a huge difference in the total charging time, but that super fast charging period in the first 30 minutes or so is a lot faster with the bigger models. The overall speeds are roughly in line with what we saw on last year's phones as well, but that's with a battery size increase this year. Not every charger supports Samsung's super fast charging protocol though, but one that does, and that I would recommend, comes from channel sponsor UGREEN, and that's the Nexode Pro. I showed off the tiny 65W charger in my Ultra review, and I've got the 160W version here. This is a 4-port charger, 3 USB-C and 1 USB-A, so you can charge multiple devices at once. Most of you watching will also have a tablet or a laptop or both, and this absolute powerhouse can fast charge them simultaneously. The GAN InsideTech means these are incredibly efficient. You can pack a huge amount of power into a device that, well, even this one still fits in the palm of my hand. These UGREEN chargers are what I genuinely use, and the 160W Nexode Pro might be enough to power your entire setup on its own. So if you're interested in these, I'll have links to them down in the video description. Alright, let's move on to the cameras, where spec-wise, we're looking at the same triple lens camera setup as last year, the same selfie lens too. We know that Samsung has announced new AI enhancements though, and we'll get new image processing with the new chipsets. First of all, I should mention that the shutter lag issue is much improved this year, just as we saw with the new Ultra. I'm not sure yet if this comes with One UI 6.1 and therefore the S23 series will improve as well, but for now this is much faster on the S24s. As for image quality, I saw some of the same general trends we have with the new Ultra, such as the higher contrast and more saturated colours. So that first of all tells me this is just how Samsung have chosen to tweak the processing this year, as opposed to any chipset differences. Usually this works really well and adds some vibrancy to photos. You get greater definition with many subjects too, like in flowers and clouds. And this carried across lenses, so what you'd see with the main lens, you'd also see with the ultra-wide lens. And then also here, moving from the main lens up to the telephoto lens, those bolder colours and contrast carry over. Another Ultra trend is toning down the sharpening, and I definitely saw that here as well. I really dislike over-sharpening, which has been Samsung's bane for years, and in some cases, you clearly get more natural-looking photos. Zoomed in here, you can actually see the added noise the sharpening generates on the S23, and you often end up with better detail, like in the door behind, with the S24s. Typically this will give you more natural and better looking images, but it's also subjective, and you may just prefer the more sharpened look of the S23, especially when viewed on a small screen like a phone. I myself found in some examples the S24 images were too soft. They seem to be lacking in detail. Here, for instance, I'm drawn to the extra detail I can see in the tyre and on the ground on the left. I think the S23 wins comfortably in this instance. This particular photo also highlights the S24's tendency to shift the white balance slightly too warm. This can give an appealing stylistic flair to your photos, but I'd have to say that generally it was the S23's capturing a more true-to-life colour temperature. The S24s also follow the Ultra's less consistent colours when switching over to the ultra-wide lens. This added pink tinge was something I saw fairly often. Beyond the warmer tone and higher contrast, I didn't see much of a zoom improvement on the telephoto lens. Certainly at 3x, there were no other obvious differences. Switching up to 5x zoom, the S24 image is now cleaner as it's not trying to sharpen as much. So is this an example of Samsung's AI zoom enhancements? Possibly, but it's hard to know for sure. Especially because at 10x and above, I no longer saw this difference. There's the S24's higher saturation and contrast, but there's no real sharpening or detail advantage. Switching up to 30x, again, it's the same deal. I'd often find the S24 teleshots were noisier too, so is this another issue with the Exynos processor? It would sometimes lead to spoiling photos to the point where it's hard to really say there's any improvement to zoomed photos at all, and there are occasions where it's actually now worse. There seems to be an issue with portrait mode as well. Can you spot that weird halo surrounding me on the right? There's a much stronger blurred outline around portrait subjects that really doesn't look natural at all. Switching up to the telephoto lens, I was seeing it there as well. I had hoped it was just on the phone's preview, but you can see it in the actual photo too, so I hope Samsung will address this for the S24s. Night mode was a mixed bag. The S24s typically had a faster capture time, and with close-up subjects especially, this was better and led to sharper images. But other times the improvement was far less noticeable, and the end results were actually quite similar between phones. Zoomed low-light photos were probably better on last year's phones in fact. Occasionally the S24 would struggle more with colours as well, so I saw each model come out on top. Neither one compares with the S24 Ultra, that's just another level up. The wider aperture on the main lens captures more light, and you get more detailed and more colour-accurate photos, not to mention the obvious zoomed low-light performance difference as well. Night video was clearly better with the S23 though. It has some stability issues for sure, but the autofocusing in low light was better, the image resolution seemed higher, and certainly the colours and the ability to capture a more realistic image were surprisingly all better with last year's phones. And then as expected when compared with the Ultra, we've got better details on the left here, and also a less noisy image. So the S24 Ultra delivers better all-round low-light performance. But here's the worst aspect by far with the new phones: HDR. This was the single biggest disappointment for me, and it ranged from a terrible downgrade, as you see here, to smaller but still obvious examples of poorer dynamic range. The one thing I really hoped though was that this problem wasn't caused by switching back to Exynos, whose HDR was famously always lacking behind Snapdragon. Comparing side by side with the Snapdragon S24 Ultra though, sadly that is the conclusion I'm leaning towards so far. Generally the Ultra showed more accurate colours, but because it's also pixel binning on that 200 megapixel main lens, images are sharper and more detailed. That toned down sharpening this year only ends up benefiting the Ultra. Those photos are still really nicely detailed and now look more natural. But with the regular S24s, we've seen that it can make photos appear soft. That main lens does make a difference, and this year more so than last. Of course, the Ultra's greatest strength is its zoom capability, and anywhere from 5x and above it has a huge advantage over the base S24s. It's not even so much the extended zoom range, it's more just the huge quality improvement the Ultra brings, and it offers you more versatility. If you like taking macro photos as well, that's also only possible on the Ultra. Okay, moving on to video, we've got new features such as 4K 120fps slow-mo, that's for all the new S24s, and we also get my favourite new feature, and perhaps the best camera feature full stop, instant slow-mo playback. This works with just a tap on any of your videos, including those that weren't even filmed at a high frame rate. But as for the video quality, you'll see a similar processing difference to what we have with photos, higher saturation and contrast. The problem is that it goes a bit too heavy on the contrast in video mode, and it has these overly yellow, warm colours too. You may happen to prefer it, but I have to say I prefer the more natural looking video from last year's models. Switching over to compare the S24 with the Ultra, it becomes apparent that the contrast issue is an Exynos problem because it's only on the S24. The Snapdragon Ultra, like the S23, has more natural looking colours and contrast. Just as we saw on the Ultra, the file sizes were considerably larger with the new phones. Not just video, but with the majority of photos too. So just be aware that they're going to eat into your storage a lot more. And finally we have the selfie camera, and image quality was similar, but I'd actually give the overall win to the S23. First of all for the colour, skin tones especially, and there's an overall green tint here with the S24. The sharpening seemed a bit more natural on the S24 though. For example, you can see with my hair. But then lower down it's really soft with my jumper, and you get a lot more detail on the left. It's strange because the jacket detail was pretty good on both, but also notice the extra noise you get in the background with the S24. Compared with the S24 Ultra, you realise this is very likely another Snapdragon Exynos issue because the Ultra closely matches the S23. It doesn't have the green tint like the base S24, the colours are more natural, and it's got the S23 sharpness as you can see in my jumper. With selfie portraits, they seem very similar at first glance, but I noticed the cutout was more harsh on the S24s, and cropping in, you can see it's because the edges are smoothed out, whereas the S23 has picked up a lot more of those fine hairs and kept them in focus. Okay, so this is a comparison of the selfie video on the S23 versus the S24, and there are a few different things to talk about. The first is the mic quality. That just seems a little bit more crisp with the S24, hopefully you can hear that as well. But then with the image quality, there are really pros and cons to both. So on the S23, the colours seem a lot more saturated and vibrant, but the white balance is also a little bit too warm. So it's more natural and realistic on the S24, but I also thought the colours were a bit too washed out. With the contrast, that's a lot darker with the S24s. For example, you can see more cloud definition in the sky, but my hair also seems a little bit too dark. The S23, on the other hand, that seems too bright. And then you've got HDR, and you probably can't tell here, so I'll cut to another clip where you can see this more clearly, but the highlights seem to be clipping a lot more on the S24. Now, we saw this as well with the photos, so I really think that this is an Exynos versus Snapdragon issue. Historically, the Snapdragon processors were always better with handling HDR, and sadly, I think that's happening here too. I definitely like some of the camera changes this year, and I've certainly been very happy with the Ultra overall. But with the S24 and the S24 Plus, I'm left questioning some concerning potential downgrades. Almost all of those align with typical Exynos processing issues, and I kind of want to import in the Snapdragon variants of the S24s and do a side-by-side comparison. There are questions not just surrounding the camera, but also performance and battery life that need answering. So do let me know if you'd also want to see a video on that, especially if you live in one of the regions where you get the Snapdragon versions and want to know if you'll experience these problems too. The S24 and S24 Plus start at $799 and $999 respectively, the same pricing as last year. These both massively undercut the $1,300 Ultra, so in terms of value for money, they're clearly both better, but it all depends on your priorities, and hopefully this video has helped you to decide which one is actually right for you. I stand by the fact that most people do not need an Ultra. As great as it is, that phone is geared towards the enthusiasts and power users who want the very best specs, though I guess if you really want the S Pen, then it's for you as well. As much as I'm tempted to say go for it regardless because it's got a Snapdragon processor worldwide, it is very expensive, and if you're not sure if you need it, you don't need it. Even if you decide you don't need an Ultra though, I'd still find it difficult to recommend one of the other S24s. They're still fantastic phones, don't get me wrong, but in terms of an upgrade over the S23 series, it's really quite minor, and as we've seen, there are some downgrades to consider too. For me, it makes it a no-brainer that you should not only stick with an S23 if you have one already, but you should probably consider getting one of those instead of the latest models, especially because they're cheaper now. The S24s bring better displays, speakers, and gaming performance, and maybe those are priorities for you. But a battery life and camera upgrade is overall debatable, and Samsung themselves highlight a software feature as the major upgrade, one that's getting brought down to the S23s anyway. I think that tells you all you need to know. If you're going for an S24 model this year, let me know in the comments what was the killer feature that sealed the deal. And of course, if you have any further questions, then let me know those too. Please give this video a like if you found it helpful, and if you want to see more videos like this, then do subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll get notified when new videos go live. The 2024 Earbuds Awards is coming next. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.